Alright, sup everybody, it's the Tominator back with another one. As you may already be aware, I recently did a two-part video on the top 10 most genetically gifted bodybuilders of all time. So I thought that for the sake of contrast, it would be interesting to take a look at some of the less genetically blessed guys as well. Of course, you gotta keep in mind that all the guys you see competing at the Olympia level have outstanding genetics, even the dudes placing dead last. Because let's face it, you need that to stand among the top 20 in the world. So when we talk about guys with poor genetics, it's a relative term. It's like saying the least athletic NBA players. Obviously, everybody who makes it to the NBA has a high degree of athleticism, but still, not everyone can be LeBron James or Russell Westbrook. And it's the same way with the IFBB. Not everybody's on the same level as a Phil Heath or a Ronnie Coleman. Some bodybuilders are just far superior to others in terms of their structure, their muscle bellies, their balance and shape, etc. Needless to say, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do a video on the worst genetics because the guys with the worst genetics would never even be able to turn pro, let alone step foot on the Olympia stage. So that's why I put the word bad in quotations like that. I admit it's an oversimplification for the sake of a catchier title. Now, you may be tempted to call that clickbait, but keep in mind a lot of my viewers don't have the best English skills, and that's quite evident just by reading some of the comments. And no offense, because I understand English isn't everybody's first language, and that's cool, it's completely okay. But that's why I went with a simpler word choice like bad rather than something more technically accurate, like the top bodybuilders who overcame genetic deficiencies, for example. That just doesn't have a good ring to it. So with that in mind, this video is going to be featuring some of the very best bodybuilders in history. We're talking Arnold Classic winners and even Mr. Olympias, who nonetheless I don't consider to be that genetically gifted. All these guys you're about to see have glaring flaws that would seem to put them at a major disadvantage, at least on paper. But of course, being the champions that they were, they all have major strengths as well. And I don't care what you want to say about politics or whatever, the fact is that you don't win bodybuilding's biggest titles without some serious strong points in your favor. So I am aware of that, but for the purposes of this video, as you might imagine, we're mainly going to be focusing on their flaws, not their virtues. So first up, we have Chris Dickerson, the 1982 Mr. Olympia. I know Nick's Strength and Power did a video on him not that long ago where he deemed Dickerson to be the least impressive Mr. Olympia ever, and to be honest, I have to agree with this. Now, in terms of the worst individual physique of a Mr. Olympia in any year, Franco in '81 was also pretty terrible. But overall, I feel that Franco Colombo had the better physique of the two, with those excellent low lats and the thick split pecs, and 1981 was just an off year for him. The thing with Dickerson, though, is that nothing really jumps out to me about him, other than his calves maybe, which are pretty well developed and have those desirable low insertions. But other than that, his whole physique just kind of screams mediocrity. His chest was probably his next best body part, and, come on, we've all seen more impressive pecs than this. So the most distinctive feature on this dude was his bony-ass elbows. And I'm sorry, but that just looks disgusting, and it really mars his aesthetics. It's like a golf ball got lodged up in there somehow. Like, come on, bro, go easy on the elbow day. Sad to say, but that seems to be his biggest claim to fame nowadays. Well, at least I guess you could say he paved the way for Ronnie and Flex Wheeler, who both have a similar unfortunate condition today. And what many people don't know or forget is that in addition to winning the 1982 Mr. Olympia, Chris Dickerson was also second the 2 years before. So he took runner-up in 1980 to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then again in 1981 to Franco Colombo. So this guy was not just a one-hit wonder. He was consistently placing very well there for a few years. Yet for him to have achieved this level of success is somewhat shocking, considering just how underwhelming he looks, especially in retrospect. I mean, after witnessing all the amazing bodybuilders that came along after him in the 80s and 90s, the Samir Banus and Lee Haney's, the Sean Rays and Kevin Lavronis, who was impressed by this whatsoever? To be fair, he is quite well balanced, and I suppose you could even say fairly aesthetic in that classic old school kind of way, but other than that, I can't really think of much to praise him for. On the other hand, I do see some pretty prominent flaws. For one, he had a relatively thick waist with very poor abs in a time where great midsections were the norm, not the exception like they are today. Another thing is that he had no real roundness or noteworthy mass to speak of. His muscle insertions also left a lot to be desired, with very short tricep heads and small flat biceps, a very average back and legs and shoulders, I mean, just look how Mike Mentzer's crushing him in the crucifix pose here. He's better in pretty much every conceivable way. So for my money, Chris Dickerson is easily the least genetically gifted bodybuilder to ever be crowned Mr. Olympia. Another guy who had some major genetic shortcomings was Rich Gaspari. First off, I gotta mention, man, he had some weird nipple issues. I mean, what the hell is going on there? Please tell us in the comments if you know what happened here, because that just don't look right. And there it is again, and it's not just that his right nipple seems to have somehow detached from his pec, but then look over to his left side, the whole lower chest region there, it looks effed up. Like, what is that, a diagonal pec split? Gotta be a tear or a surgery gone wrong. But anyway, Gaspari was the winner of the very first Arnold Classic back in 1989. He also placed second at the Olympia 3 years in a row, behind Lee Haney from 1986 to 1988. So those are some mighty impressive accolades for a guy with a thick waist and hips, narrow shoulders, and a lousy V-taper. In my opinion, his arms also looked a little too short compared to his body, and that kind of threw off his proportions as well. I just don't like his structure at all, and his muscle insertions weren't the best either. On the plus side, Rich did have some pretty good legs for his era, and he made up for a lot of his structural flaws with an unprecedented level of conditioning. I believe he was the first man to ever display striated glutes on stage, so that was kind of his legacy, I guess you might say. His skin was paper thin, and you could just see veins popping out everywhere. He also put together some well-choreographed posing routines, to his credit, but then again, back in the late 80s, this was par for the course. They all posed well back then. Like Dickerson, he was also fairly balanced, so I can get why he did so well, but still, his genetics were crap compared to some of his contemporaries like Lee Haney, Bertil Fox, and also these two pictured here. So you can see what I was saying about the lack of a V-taper and roundness when you put him next to someone like Thierry Pastel, who completely smokes him in this shot, if you ask me. Obviously, he's outmassing these guys, but their lines and muscle bellies are just so much more pleasing to look at. Gaspari's physique is almost ugly in comparison. And speaking of ugly physiques, where would this video be without Branch Warren? You all knew he was going to be mentioned. Perhaps the most hideous bodybuilder in history, towards the end of his career, Branch truly became grotesque. This is like anti-aesthetics. It's what you would aspire to avoid looking like at all costs. Now, keep in mind, a lot of this had to do with injuries and drug abuse and him just being washed up, so genetically speaking, he's not nearly as bad as you might remember him. Case in point, just go back to his younger days in the early 2000s, where you'll witness a much more appealing and balanced physique. Hell, it wouldn't even be a stretch to call this aesthetic. So I actually think that Branch's genetics aren't all that bad in a sense, but as he got older and continued to add more and more muscle, you could see his potential for playing the mass game wasn't as good as some of his larger framed competitors, and a lot of his genetic shortcomings started becoming more noticeable. For one, his proportions, he was always lower body dominant, but as you just saw, his body used to be much more balanced. As he got bigger, his back and arms never truly grew along to match his massive wheels though, and Branch also has some pretty wide hips, so this no doubt helps set the foundation for a huge set of legs, but wide hips is one of the worst structural flaws you can have as a bodybuilder because it draws away from the V-taper and means that your shoulders have to be that much wider to compensate. His arms were also quite bad. He did manage to bring them up to respectable levels, but they were still always undersized compared to his lower body, and his forearms were basically non-existent. Just look at how pathetically underdeveloped they are, even next to someone like Jay Cutler, who also had weak forearms for the record. And his back was also pretty terrible for most of his career. I will say it did look surprisingly impressive in a couple of shows, but in general, the lack of detail and separation and taper and width in the lat spreads was pretty horrendous for a guy who managed to collect 2 Arnold Classic victories and a second place finish at the 2009 Mr. Olympia. So just like Gaspari, Branch was able to surpass far more genetically gifted opponents by outconditioning them. He brought that same type of hard, grainy, compact muscle mass and vascularity that Rich did, and so despite his god-awful lines and proportions, he was able to achieve an incredible amount of success. Plus, let's be honest, politics played a role in some of his high placings, especially in his later years, like when he finished second to Dexter Jackson at the 2015 Arnold Classic, while being absolutely riddled by injuries and looking like some kind of deformed gremlin. So that was just ridiculous, and I think it was the main reason Arnold finally spoke out that year. But again, we can't fault his genetics for that, necessarily, because it was mostly the result of injuries and just being past his prime. but we can fault his genetics for all those weak body parts and balance issues I just mentioned. Next up, we have Dennis Wolf. And I know at least one of my subscribers is going to hate me for this, so sorry, Dazzer, but I gotta keep it real with you guys, man. And the truth is, I don't think Wolf has very good genetics for a bodybuilder on his level. Now, true, he does have an excellent frame. His structure is pretty close to perfect, with the narrow waist and hips and the wide shoulders. And just being a taller guy, his larger skeletal frame allows him to more easily pack on the mass, which is definitely an advantage, especially in today's bodybuilding. So I will concede that structurally speaking, Wolf is great, but his muscle bellies, not so much. All you have to do is put him in the front double bicep and all his flaws become immediately apparent. The super high lats make for an awkwardly elongated torso. Now, I know some people prefer this Y-taper look over the classic V-taper, but to my eyes, this is too much. It completely disrupts his flow. Not to mention his high lat insertions also hinder his back development when seen from the rear. His biceps are also subpar, short, but also curiously flat. So usually you have either longer, flatter biceps or shorter biceps with more of a peak. Dennis has the worst of both worlds here. And the calves, of course, are terrible and really spoil an otherwise amazing set of wheels because his quad and hamstring sweep is crazy, but when you look below the knees, that is just pitiful. And there's those high lats really hampering him in the back department, as I was just mentioning. So yeah, Wolf, he may not be on the same level as the first three people I just mentioned in terms of poor genetics, because he certainly has some outstanding features, but the few weaknesses he does have are just so glaring, and I think that's why he's never been able to truly challenge at the Olympia. He did manage to claim an Arnold Classic in 2014 though, and for what it's worth, I think he probably could have taken it one of those years when Branch won too. So despite his genetic deficiencies, the Big Bad Wolf definitely has led a highly successful pro career. And next up we have Dorian Yates. And if I offended a couple of you by putting Wolf in this video, I'm fully bracing myself for a veritable onslaught of hate with these next couple of guys because they are arguably the two most worshipped bodybuilders in history. And yes indeed, you didn't miss here, your eyes don't deceive you, because first up is the Shadow. And no, I don't think he had very good genetics compared to all the people he was beating. If you recall, most of the guys I had in the top 10 most genetically gifted list were from the 90s. We're talking Paul Dillette, Lee Priest, Flex Wheeler, Sean Ray, Kevin Levrone, Ronnie Coleman, etc., etc. The list goes on. So these are some of the very best bodybuilders we've ever seen, and Dorian Yates beat them all. Still, in spite of his success, I think you'd have to be a true fanboy to say Dorian had better genetics than any of the people I just mentioned. So that's why I'm featuring him in this video. I mean, look how unassuming he was in his early years. Like the caption points out, who would look at this picture and say, wow, that's going to be Mr. Olympia one day? It's not that he had bad genetics per se. Of course he didn't. You don't win 6 Sandows with bad genetics. It's just that, like Dennis Wolf, he had a number of glaring weaknesses and wasn't blessed with the shape and roundness of his more genetically gifted competitors. Now, Dorian may have had the best back and calves ever, and some pretty damn good forearms as well, but that's pretty much where it stops in terms of strong body parts, because he had a host of weak ones. The chest being one of them. Just look at his side chest pose. See how his near pec kind of caves in at the top there? His chest was shallow, and his upper chest was always relatively weak. You can also see that his biceps and triceps, they're looking very underwhelming here, so arms was another weak point. And he had oddly shaped quads as well, with an overdeveloped teardrop and poor outer sweep, and his shoulders were nothing spectacular either. Combine that with a blocky midsection, and yeah, it's hard to see how this guy ever won so many Olympias when you go body part by body part. But that's where my criticisms stop, because Dorian Yates was more than the sum of his parts. It was almost magical the way he was able to transform weaknesses into strengths through the effectiveness of his posing. For example, those undersized triceps, they don't look so small anymore when he presses them into his massive lats in the side tricep pose, displaying one of the best horseshoes of all time. Likewise, his unimpressive shoulders don't look so subpar in the back double bicep, when you can clearly see all 3 heads separated and fully developed. I would argue that, along with Ronnie, Dorian was the master of the mandatory poses. His only weak ones being the side chest, the most muscular, which wasn't even mandatory when he competed, by the way, and the front double bicep. And that last one, only because he tore his bicep and that threw off his symmetry, which of course we can't count as a genetic flaw. The other way he excelled was, of course, with his trademark granite hard mass. He was able to beat shapelier, more aesthetic bodybuilders like Kevin Levrone through superior conditioning and overall mass, as we can see here in the 1995 Mr. Olympia. This was a contest where I believe he did indeed deserve to win, despite Levrone looking incredible and being among my personal favorites. So yeah, Dorian definitely had a lot of things going for him. A large frame and enviable structure being yet another I haven't even mentioned. So it'd be downright ignorant to say he had poor genetics. But the reason I put him in here in this video is because this is about the top bodybuilders who overcame genetic limitations. So you have to weigh their level of success against their raw genetic makeup, and in that respect, Dorian Yates really made the most of what he had to work with, and he absolutely maximized his potential. Another guy who really transcended his genetics was Arnold. Yes, everybody's favorite, the Oak himself, by far the most adored bodybuilder in history, so I fully expect a lot of backlash for simply mentioning his name in any kind of negative way. But before you smash that dislike button, let me explain why he's on here. So here's the deal. Arnold had one of the best physiques ever. Perhaps the most iconic image of a bodybuilder we've ever seen. And I do think he was extremely aesthetic and would rather look like him than probably 99% of other bodybuilders throughout history. So I'm not hating on him, okay? But the fact is, just like with Dorian, when you break him down body part by body part, it's easy to spot a lot of weaknesses. The legs, for one, are so obviously undersized compared to his massive upper body. Sometimes his proportions appear almost cartoonish, like a bodybuilding caricature. Even the calves, which do look respectable here, Arnold admits were originally one of his greatest weak points, which is why you can sometimes find him in his younger days in pictures like this, posing in knee-deep water. Arnold seemed to be unreasonably embarrassed by how bad they were, so even though he eventually was able to bring them up, genetically speaking, they weren't very good. And his upper legs were never very good. Even for his era where everybody, except for Tom Platz, had leaner thighs, Arnold's were average at best. Sure, I will concede they did look pretty impressive in a couple of contests, like in 1973 and 74, but in general, they always tended to get overshadowed by his upper body, which on that note also had some serious imbalances. So as you probably know, Arnold was famous for his pecs and biceps, but as a result of those body parts being so outstanding, his shoulders, triceps, and even lats kind of suffered in comparison. Look at how his pecs dominate his front lat spread. This was probably his worst pose, and it's mainly because his pecs were just too good compared to everything else. His triceps also never quite matched his enormous biceps. They say that the triceps should account for about 2/3 of the upper arm, but in Arnold's case, it seems like this ratio is reversed. And you can also note the asymmetry with the right one being noticeably higher peaked than the left. And finally, one more flaw was his wide waist. Now, I know what you're thinking, like Arnold had an amazing waist, and he definitely did, especially compared to the guys today. But Arnold claimed he had a 34-inch waist, and by today's standards, that is top-notch, but in the 70s, there were a number of bodybuilders with much slimmer than that. So this is the reason why he always twisted in almost all of his poses, to hide his thicker waistline. And I'm not just theorizing here, Arnold himself has admitted as much. Now, most of these criticisms may come across as nitpicking, and yeah, mainly they are. But when we're talking about a guy who not only won 7 Mr. Olympia titles, but who is also widely regarded by many people as the best bodybuilder in history, I mean, we have to kind of go extra hard on the dude, right? So, considering that he definitely did not have the best genetics in history, it's impossible to overstate how impressive that is. In fact, sometimes flaws are what make a bodybuilder what he is. They provide a unique and iconic look. This is one reason I believe Arnold's physique is really one of a kind and will never be duplicated again. And it's also what makes a lot of these old school 70s bodybuilders so memorable, because they all brought something different to the table, and their weaknesses were a key part of that. But anyway, that's all for this one, guys. Hopefully, if you're an Arnold or a Dorian fan, you understand where I'm coming from and don't hate me too much for this. In any case, let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I miss anybody here? Keep in mind, I was aiming to profile, some of the best and most accomplished bodybuilders, not the big Lennys and Dave Palumbos of the world, so don't be throwing out names like that. But you know the drill. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more. And until next time, homies, I'm the Tominator, signing out, and I'll be back.